What if I told you that everything you believed about Victorian mansions was untrue? Are you ready to learn the truth about what lay behind the luxurious facades we see in movies, and the price that was paid for this splendor? These houses, which became symbols of the wealth and prosperity of the greatest empire, were in fact the scene of a daily battle against the cold, damp, and complete lack of comfort that we take for granted today. The era that gave the world steam engines and electricity paradoxically left its most privileged inhabitants trapped in everyday problems that almost no one remembers today. We are accustomed to associating the Victorian era with refined manners, elegant dresses, and impeccable style. But behind this polished image lay a harsh reality: constant drafts, the smell of coal and rotting waste, and incredible noise penetrating through thin walls. The Victorian mansion, the pinnacle of architectural fashion, was also a machine for producing discomfort and disease, in which only the servants who worked tirelessly were truly comfortable. In this video, we reveal the unsavory secrets of upper-class life that will forever change your perception of Victorian England. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the true price, expressed in sweat, pain, and lives, of simply building a roof over one's head in medieval England. I will reveal the best-kept secret. The architectural refinements of the Victorian era were the main enemy of warmth and comfort. The external beauty and grandeur of houses often concealed the harsh reality of everyday life. The main purpose of a Victorian mansion was not to provide comfort, but to demonstrate the social status and wealth of the owner, which led to decisions that were completely impractical for living. Architecture was meant to impress, not to keep people warm. The higher the ceilings and the more space there was, the more impressive the house looked in the eyes of society. But it was precisely these elements that made the rooms cold and difficult to heat. Huge ceilings and spacious rooms created a feeling of grandeur and solemnity. However, in the damp and cold English climate, such spaces were extremely inefficient. Warm air rose to the top, where it was useless to people. The fireplace located at the bottom heated only a small space around it. The upper part of the room remained constantly cold. This was one of the main problems that residents faced every day. The building materials and methods of the time also contributed to heat loss. Walls were often built of brick or stone without proper insulation. Heat escaped unhindered, especially in winter. The lack of effective insulation and frequent defects in the masonry led to constant drafts. These drafts permeated the house, despite the servants' efforts to eliminate them. Even tightly closed rooms were rarely completely protected from the cold. The cold stone cladding on the walls made the situation worse. Combined with the humid air, it made the rooms particularly uncomfortable. Many rooms were unsuitable for long stays during the cold season. The floors in the houses were also a major source of cold. They were often built over poorly insulated basements or even directly on the ground. The cold rose from below and quickly spread throughout the floor. It did not matter how expensive the carpet on top was. It only created the illusion of warmth. The first floors remained cool and damp for most of the year. To stay warm, residents had to wear several layers of clothing even inside the house. Warm robes, woolen blankets, and thick suits were commonplace. This had a negative impact on health, especially for children and the elderly. Victorian houses had many windows, including large panoramic and stained glass ones. They were an important part of the architectural style and demonstrated the owner's taste. But in terms of warmth, it was a real disaster. Single-pane glass did little to retain heat. Wooden frames dried out and warped over time. This resulted in gaps through which icy air could enter the house. Door design also rarely took heat conservation into account. The house had many interior doors with poorly fitted frames. They created additional pathways for cold air to circulate. Doors leading to unheated corridors or directly to the street were particularly problematic. Cold air spread freely through the house through them. This made even well-heated rooms less comfortable. As a result, despite thousands of tons of coal burned in fireplaces, most of the Victorian mansion remained cold and damp. Only a few rooms managed to retain heat. These were usually the living room or dining room, where the family spent most of their time. Bedrooms, hallways, and service areas were as cold as a cellar. People went to bed in freezing rooms and woke up to the same cold. Comfort was sacrificed for outward grandeur. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about such an impractical approach to heating in homes of this caliber? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Want to know the main secret of the Victorian era? The entire heating system of a Victorian mansion was based on open fireplaces, and it was a real hell for those who lived there. The fireplace, being the central element of the living room, burned tons of coal and provided only local heat, but at the same time made the air in the house incredibly dirty and unbearable to breathe. Smoke and soot not only penetrated the room where the fireplace was burning, but also spread throughout the house through the ventilation system and drafts, which had a very negative effect on health. Low-quality coal, which was cheap and readily available, was used as fuel. However, this coal emitted huge amounts of soot, carbon monoxide, and other harmful substances. As a result, the air in London and other large cities was literally saturated with black smoke, creating the famous Victorian fog, which was actually smog. Inside the house, soot settled on furniture, walls, clothing, and, most unpleasantly, on the lungs of the inhabitants. Servants had to spend hours every day cleaning fireplaces, removing ashes, and wiping away soot. It was endless, dirty, and hard work that was necessary to maintain some semblance of order, but it did not do any good. The system of chimneys and pipes was complex and often inefficient. Poor draft, blockages, and backdrafts were common. This meant that instead of going outside, the smoke began to flow back into the room, filling it with a pungent smell and soot, which had a very negative effect on the health of the residents. In addition, fireplaces served as powerful exhaust fans, drawing not only smoke, but also a huge amount of already heated air out of the house. To compensate for this volume, cold outside air was sucked in through cracks and gaps in windows and doors. Thus, the fireplace simultaneously heated and cooled the room, making the heating process not only dirty, but also extremely inefficient. Carbon monoxide, invisible and odorless, was a constant threat. Poorly cleaned or improperly constructed chimneys could cause it to accumulate in bedrooms and living rooms. Many cases of sudden death, which were attributed to illness or other causes, may in fact have been related to poisoning by this gas. This entire heating system required constant attention and enormous physical labor. Servants had to carry coal in buckets to the upper floors, regularly clean the chimneys, and monitor the fire. It was slavery for the sake of warmth, which still did not provide real comfort, but only created problems. But knowledge of the terrain was only half the battle. Ready to learn how the Apaches turned stones and dust into their main weapon of invisibility? But knowledge of the heating system was only half the battle. Read on to the next chapter to learn how Victorian fashion and decor created even more gruesome living conditions. The fashion for thick, heavy drapery, multiple layers, and a huge number of decorative items created ideal conditions for the accumulation of household dirt and unsanitary conditions. The interiors were literally buried in fabrics, decorations, and small details. All this together made cleaning not just a routine task, but a real endless nightmare for the servants. Walls, windows, and floors were covered with a huge amount of textiles. Heavy curtains, multi-layered drapes, and canopies over beds were considered a mandatory sign of comfort and prosperity. However, it was often impossible to wash such fabrics due to their size and cost. These materials quickly accumulated dust, soot from fireplaces, and moisture. In a humid climate, the fabrics took a long time to dry and absorbed odors. Over time, they became a breeding ground for dirt and harmful microorganisms. Carpets were particularly dangerous. Victorians preferred thick, dense carpets that covered the floor from wall to wall. A floor without a carpet was considered a sign of poverty or neglect. Such carpets were impossible to clean properly. They absorbed street dirt, dust, coal residue, and sand. All of this accumulated over the years. Due to the lack of vacuum cleaners, cleaning carpets became a difficult ritual. They were taken outside and beaten by hand. This could only be done in dry weather, so most of the time the carpets remained dirty. The interior was overloaded with furniture, which often had complex shapes, carvings, and soft upholstery. Every bend and fold collected dust. There were very few simple and smooth surfaces. Huge wardrobes, massive sofas and armchairs, and numerous tables with decorative tablecloths filled the rooms almost completely. Moving such furniture for cleaning was difficult and heavy. Many places were not cleaned at all for years. Collecting and displaying wealth was an important part of the Victorian style. Shelves, mantelpieces, and tables were cluttered with figurines, porcelain, silver trinkets, and books. Empty space was considered a sign of bad taste. Each of these items had to be dusted regularly. This required a tremendous amount of time and effort. The richer the house, the more work fell on the shoulders of the servants. The accumulation of dust and soot had a direct negative impact on health. Doctors of the time were already beginning to notice the link between dirt and disease. However, fashion and social habits changed very slowly. Allergies, breathing problems, chronic coughs, and fatigue were common. Children and the elderly suffered particularly. The luxurious surroundings only exacerbated these problems. The air in the house was saturated with tiny particles of dust, fabric fibers, and soot. Combined with the poor ventilation typical of Victorian homes, this air was extremely harmful. It was difficult even for a healthy person to breathe. Only in the wealthiest homes, where a large number of servants worked, was it possible to maintain visible cleanliness. But even there, it was more about outward order than real hygiene. The underlying problems did not disappear. All this luxury turned out to be a real trap. The more money a person had, the more objects filled their home, and the worse their quality of life became. Paradoxically, more modest homes with minimal decor were much cleaner and healthier. Fewer fabrics meant less dust and dirt. Sometimes simplicity was a real luxury. Like this video if you think minimalism is not just a trend, but a way to make life easier. What you are about to learn will change your perception of wealthy Victorian life. Today we take clean, hot water available at any time for granted. But in a Victorian mansion, it was a real luxury that had to be obtained through hard physical labor and enormous effort. In those days, there was no centralized water supply or modern water heaters. Every bucket of hot water was the result of long, exhausting work that required time, effort, and strict adherence to a schedule. Even the wealthiest families could not simply turn on the tap and get water for bathing, washing, or cleaning. The simple use of water became an entire operation requiring the participation of several people and precise planning. In most wealthy homes, water came from a well or was collected in large tanks on the roof of the house. However, the water was far from always clean and had to be carefully checked before use. Most often it was used for washing, cleaning, and laundry, and drinking water, if it was available at all, was either purchased separately or brought in from verified sources. Water delivery became a separate task, as it was vital but not always accessible. Sometimes water stagnated in cisterns, heated by the sun or the addition of coal, which complicated its use. Every water intake became a serious challenge for everyone who lived and worked in the house. The water delivery system inside the house was very primitive and inconvenient. Servants had to carry water by hand, bucket by bucket, up the stairs to the upper floors. Water for bathing, cooking, washing dishes, and cleaning took a lot of time and effort. Sometimes it took several trips to fill the bathtub or wash basins. It was one of the most exhausting and constant duties of the servants, requiring strict adherence to a schedule and physical endurance. Failure to perform this work could cause dissatisfaction among the owners and disrupt the routine of the entire house. Taking a hot bath required a tremendous amount of time and resources. First, the water was heated on the stove or in a special tank using fire. Then it was transferred to the bathtub by hand. The whole process could take several hours, which is why regular hot baths were rare. People often limited themselves to wiping their bodies with wet sponges or a quick wash, which was considered the norm. The laboriousness of the process and the lack of time made washing a real luxury, available only occasionally, even for the wealthiest. Even with the advent of the first plumbing systems, the problem of hot water did not disappear. Gas or coal stoves were used to heat water, but they were unreliable, often broke down, and could pose a danger to the inhabitants of the house. Sometimes the water was heated unevenly, and servants had to constantly monitor the process to prevent accidents. This made access to hot water limited, unpredictable, and requiring constant supervision by service personnel. The lack of running water in bedrooms and bathrooms meant that jugs and basins had to be filled and carried out by hand. Dirty water from wash basins also had to be cleaned up and was regularly carried out by servants. This constant movement of water, both clean and dirty, created a risk of spreading disease and worried the owners. Even wealthy families felt that cleanliness and health depended directly on the work of the servants and careful control of the process. All these difficulties led to the use of water being strictly regulated. A hot bath was considered a luxury and was not a daily ritual, as it is today. Body cleanliness was maintained by wiping with wet sponges or quick washing, rather than full bathing. Even the smallest procedures required planning, time, and physical effort. Gradually, a special lifestyle developed, where water was a valuable resource and its economical use was considered the norm. This situation clearly illustrates the paradox of Victorian luxury. Wealth allowed for the construction of huge, impressive houses, but could not guarantee basic comforts related to water. Even the wealthiest people faced difficulties that seem incredible to us today. Their daily lives were full of restrictions, where luxury was combined with deprivation. Behind the magnificent halls and luxurious rooms lay the enormous effort required to simply maintain cleanliness and personal comfort. Want to learn how soldiers created even more powerful explosive devices right on the battlefield using materials at hand? What were the next comfort issues that we don't even think about today? Victorian mansions suffered from constant darkness, which made them gloomy and uncomfortable despite the large number of windows. The architecture of these houses, with their high ceilings, deep halls, and long corridors, did not allow daylight to penetrate far inside. Even on a clear sunny day, the rooms remained dim, and the light that did penetrate through the windows was often absorbed by heavy curtains, thick draperies, dark wallpaper, and massive furniture. In such conditions, the houses seemed oppressive, and the feeling of spaciousness and luxury was combined with an impenetrable gloom. Artificial lighting was either expensive or extremely dangerous. In the early Victorian era, candles and oil lamps were the main sources of light. They provided very dim, scattered lighting and required constant maintenance. Servants had to clean the lamps daily, trim the wicks, refill the oil, and carefully monitor their condition. Any carelessness could lead to a fire, so working with lighting was stressful and tiring, becoming a daily routine. The advent of gas lighting significantly increased the brightness of rooms and revolutionized home lighting. However, it created new problems. Gas lamps provided brighter light, but it was flickering and harsh, which strained the eyes. At the same time, gas lamps gave off heat and an unpleasant smell, which made the atmosphere in the house even worse. Gas was explosive, and any leak could cause poisoning or fire. In the homes of wealthy owners, pipes and burners had to be constantly monitored, which added to the workload of the servants. In addition, unpleasant odors were a constant part of life in a Victorian mansion. They penetrated the interior due to an imperfect sewage system, the lack of modern toilets, and methods of waste disposal. Service areas such as kitchens, laundry rooms, and utility rooms were sources of strong smells of food, garbage, and dampness. Even in the formal rooms, these odors could be noticeable, especially if vapors from kitchen work drifted through the service corridors. The dirty coal smoke used to heat the houses mixed with the smells of garbage, sewage, and poor ventilation. In large mansions, food waste and household garbage could be stored in the house for several days before being taken outside. Servants working in these conditions were also a source of additional odors: sweat, smoke, and clothing that was not always clean. All these aromas created a unique and pungent background that was familiar to the residents. Even the clothes worn in the house were saturated with smoke from the fireplaces and the smells of unwashed bodies. They became an additional source of unpleasant odors that could not be completely eliminated. In such conditions, perfumes and colognes were used not so much for pleasure or aesthetics as to mask the ubiquitous smell of dust, soot, dirt, and human sweat. These aromas were omnipresent, and no amount of cleaning or airing could completely get rid of them. As a result, the Victorian mansion, which we are accustomed to seeing as a model of luxury, was in reality both a majestic and extremely impractical space from a hygiene perspective. The combination of insufficient light, constant smoke, odors, and heavy textiles made staying in such houses far less comfortable than it might seem to a modern viewer. Are you ready to learn how constant noise in a Victorian mansion, which we tend to think of as quiet and peaceful, actually became one of the main problems for its residents? At first glance, such houses seem to be the epitome of majestic silence and dignified order. But in reality, life in them was filled with a constant, sometimes deafening background noise. The huge rooms with high ceilings and thin partitions had virtually no sound insulation, and any sound easily spread throughout the house. Every step, every creak of the floor or open door was amplified by the emptiness of the large halls and corridors. In addition, the numerous staff and the operation of various mechanical systems created constant noise pollution that accompanied the residents at every turn. The Victorian mansion, filled with wealth and luxury, in fact became a space where there was almost no peace and quiet, and every sound could be irritating and tiring. The most obvious source of noise was the servants themselves. Dozens of people were constantly moving around the house, performing their numerous duties. They carried food and water, cleaned the rooms, made the beds, lit the fireplaces, and kept every room tidy. The sound of footsteps on the stairs, creaking floorboards, clattering dishes, thumping furniture, and conversations carried throughout the house, amplified in long corridors and halls with high ceilings. The servants' quick work added sharpness and volume to the sounds, creating a sense of constant movement. Even when the residents tried to rest or concentrate, the noise of the servants invariably accompanied them, making silence an almost unattainable luxury. Kitchens, often located in the basement or on the first floor, were the center of the sonic chaos. There was the constant clatter of pots and pans, the noise of food being prepared, loud conversations, and the commands of servants. The sounds from the kitchen spread throughout the house through ventilation shafts, open doors, and small food elevators. Even in the formal rooms on the upper floors, residents could hear this noise, which became part of their daily lives. The kitchen was not just a place for cooking, but a source of constant pressure on the ears, making staying in the house sometimes stressful and tiring. The heating and water supply systems also added to the noise. Coal-fired boilers, steam pipes, pumps, and hot water distribution mechanisms emitted loud bangs, knocks, and a constant hum. Even open fireplaces, with their crackling and hissing, added to the sonic chaos, creating the impression that the house had a life of its own, a noisy one at that. Every time a pump turned on, a boiler ignited, or coal crackled, it added to the overall picture, creating a constant background noise that was difficult to ignore. The noise from the street was no less significant. The streets of Victorian cities resounded with the clatter of horses' hooves, the clanging of carts, the cries of merchants, the noise of passing carriages, and the footsteps of passers-by. The thick walls of the houses provided some protection from outside sounds, but it was impossible to completely drown them out. The constant intrusion of noise from outside added to the background noise of the home, creating a sense of continuous activity. The residents of the house could hear the city even from the most isolated rooms, which increased their feelings of anxiety and fatigue. A particular source of noise pollution was the system for summoning servants. This involved a complex set of bells connected by cords to each room. Each bell had a unique sound that told the servant which room was calling for them. The constant ringing, often simultaneous and contradictory, created a nerve-wracking background noise, adding to the tension and the feeling that the house never rested. Even in those moments when the residents tried to find peace, these bells reminded them of the constant activity and the need to respond to what was happening. All this created an atmosphere of constant stress. The residents could not find complete privacy and silence, even in the most isolated corners of the house. In order to concentrate or rest, they had to go to distant rooms where the noise was a little quieter, but it never stopped completely. Every sound, from the footsteps of the servants to the crackling of the fireplace, was a constant reminder of the presence of the house's machinery and its constant activity. Even simple reading or conversation in a quiet room was accompanied by background noise that made it difficult to relax. It is interesting to imagine how Victorians coped with this constant sound pressure. Modern people have headphones, earplugs, and soundproof rooms, but such remedies did not exist back then. The psychological stress from the constant noise was enormous and greatly affected well-being, mood, and quality of life. In order to find even a little peace, residents had to carefully plan their time, choosing moments to rest when the noise was at its lowest. In the next chapter, we will move from large-scale noise barriers to miniature devices that could radically change the course of an entire secret operation inside a mansion. We will discuss in detail how the Victorian fashion for cleanliness and order became a powerful tool for controlling and pressuring servants, affecting all aspects of their work and lives. The pursuit of cleanliness in the Victorian era was almost religious and was perceived as a sacred duty of the owners of the house. But in practice, this pursuit did not result in comfort for the residents, but in an incredible, almost unbearable burden for the servants, who had to maintain the outward appearance of the mansion every day. New knowledge about germs and hygiene only reinforced the demands for cleanliness, turning routine cleaning tasks into hours-long and extremely exhausting rituals that were impossible without a large staff of workers who were constantly on the move. Daily cleaning began at dawn and took hours, sometimes half a day. Servants had to light the fireplaces, remove ashes from stoves and fireplaces, fetch water from the cellar or well, carefully polish silver and copper objects, scrub the floors until they shone, and check every surface for dust. All this took place in cold and dark rooms while the owners were still asleep, which made the work particularly difficult and physically exhausting. Particular attention was paid to polishing and shining interior items. Silverware, copper door handles, mirrors, wooden furniture, and decorative elements had to shine like new. Polishing required the use of special pastes and repeated wiping, sometimes with expensive oils and compounds to preserve the shine. Servants worked for hours with rags, brushes, and sponges to achieve the desired effect, which almost instantly disappeared due to dust, soot from fireplaces, and smoke coming in from the street. Washing linen and clothes was a separate, equally exhausting task. In those days, washing machines did not exist, so all linen, tablecloths, bedding, and clothes were washed by hand. Bed linen was boiled in huge cauldrons, carefully wrung out, and hung out to dry on the street or in specially equipped rooms. Work in the laundry was considered one of the most difficult and exhausting, as it combined physical exertion, high temperatures, and the need for constant concentration. The constant battle against dirt was often doomed to failure. Coal smoke from the street penetrated the house through doors and windows, settling on furniture and floors, while an inefficient heating system spread smoke and soot throughout the house. Even after several hours of thorough cleaning, by evening the surfaces were again covered with dust, soot, and dirt particles, making the servants' efforts almost useless in the long run. The servants had to not only clean and maintain cleanliness, but do so in such a way that their presence remained invisible to the owners and guests. They had to move through dark back corridors, narrow service staircases, and labyrinths of service corridors. Such routes were inconvenient and dangerous, especially when carrying heavy trays of food, buckets of water, or baskets of laundry. The slightest mistake could lead to a fall or damage to expensive interior items, which added stress and responsibility to each employee. Every day in the house turned into an endless cycle of cleaning, polishing, and washing. Even the most careful and experienced servant could not completely cope with the amount of dirt and dust. Cleanliness in the house was temporary, and maintaining it in perfect condition required constant, almost heroic work. Despite this, the exterior of the mansion had to remain impeccable, creating an illusion of ease and luxury for the owners and their guests, while the real hard work remained behind the scenes. Contrary to popular belief, Victorian mansions suffered not only from the cold, but also from extremely poor air quality, which made living in them uncomfortable and unhealthy. Ventilation, as a separate engineering system, was poorly developed and insufficiently effective. The air in the house was hardly ever renewed, which led to the accumulation of stagnant, dirty air masses saturated with soot, dust, and the odors of gases and smoke. Residents often felt suffocated, especially in deep rooms and corridors where there was almost no airflow. Open fireplaces, which were supposed to provide natural draft and air renewal, were extremely inefficient. They could only draw air from the rooms where the fire was burning, leaving all other rooms with virtually no circulation. Moreover, fireplaces sometimes drew air from basements, which was cold, damp, and contained unpleasant odors such as mold or the smell of coal. Instead of fresh air, residents got a mixture of soot and stale odors, which only worsened the overall quality of the atmosphere in the house. Windows were mainly used for ventilation, which became extremely impractical during the cold season. Opening a window meant letting icy air into the house and negating all heating efforts. As a result, most windows were kept closed almost all day, which prevented air from being renewed and created a constant feeling of stagnation. Under these conditions, the rooms quickly filled with the smells of food, smoke from fireplaces, and moisture, making it unpleasant and unhealthy to stay in the house. Poor ventilation also contributed to the spread of odors throughout the house. The smells of cooking, coal smoke, and sewage penetrated the rooms and permeated the furniture, curtains, and textiles. The stagnant air in the bedrooms was particularly unhealthy, negatively affecting the sleep and well-being of the residents. Even in the formal rooms where guests were entertained, odors were sometimes noticeable, especially if the ventilation ducts were dirty or partially blocked. Humidity was also a serious problem, especially in basements and service rooms. The lack of modern waterproofing materials and poor protection against rainwater penetration meant that moisture seeped through walls and floors. The combination of moisture and poor ventilation created an ideal environment for mold and mildew, which not only spoiled the interior, but also became a source of disease. Mold grew in dark and damp corners, on wooden surfaces, fabrics, and old carpets. Mold spores constantly present in the air caused chronic respiratory diseases in residents and servants. Servants working in basements, kitchens, and laundries suffered particularly badly. Respiratory diseases, coughs, allergies, and chronic fatigue were common companions for people who spent time in these rooms. Even the healthiest residents experienced discomfort as stale air seeped into living quarters through cracks, doorways, and ventilation ducts. Sanitary conditions in Victorian mansions were far from ideal, even in the wealthiest homes. Despite the advent of flush toilets, they did not solve the main problem of waste disposal. Sewer systems were primitive and unreliable, and the lack of modern technology led to constant unsanitary conditions in the home. At the beginning of the Victorian era, chamber pots and cesspools were still in use in homes. Servants carried out and emptied the pots daily, which was considered one of the most unpleasant and dirty duties. Waste was taken out and dumped into pits, which was extremely unhygienic and created unpleasant odors inside and around the house. Even when flush toilets appeared in homes, they were often connected to a communal system that was leaky and unreliable. Pipes could leak or become clogged, creating a constant source of odor. The stench from the sewer penetrated through faulty siphons and ventilation holes, causing discomfort and illness. A particular problem was the so-called water closets, which were often located inside the house or in small outbuildings. Due to the poor quality of the pipes and connections, These devices became a source of unpleasant odors and constant air pollution. Servants had to constantly monitor their cleanliness and serviceability, which added to their workload and responsibilities. Waste and garbage were disposed of extremely poorly. Garbage cans and bins were often kept right inside the house or in the yard, attracting rodents and insects. Garbage collection was irregular, which led to the accumulation of waste, the proliferation of bacteria, and the spread of infections. The entire hygiene system was based on the constant manual labor of servants. Servants kept toilets, sinks, and bathtubs clean, carried out dirty water, and kept the house tidy to hide the shortcomings of the primitive infrastructure. This endless labor was aimed at creating the illusion of cleanliness and order, hiding the real problems with ventilation, waste, and unsanitary conditions in Victorian mansions. Despite the large number of people in a Victorian mansion, life there was often full of isolation and loneliness, especially for the owners. Even if the house was filled with servants, relatives, and guests, it did not mean that anyone felt truly part of something alive and warm. The enormous size of the house created a feeling of emptiness, and the strict hierarchy between family members and servants reinforced psychological alienation and loneliness. Sometimes you could walk through entire corridors and rooms without a single person stopping to say a word, which added to the feeling of cold distance in such a special house. The space that was supposed to symbolize wealth and success often became a barrier between people, dividing them more than uniting them. Every corner of the mansion, whether it was the grand halls or the quiet corridors on the upper floors, emphasized the gap between the lives of different people living under the same roof. The owners and servants lived in different worlds that intersected only when necessary. The servants occupied their quarters in the basements and attics, working in the shadow of the rich decor that was inaccessible to them. Their lives were full of duties and strict rules, and their presence was felt only as a backdrop to the comfort of their masters. Communication between them was kept to a minimum so as not to disturb the atmosphere of peace and order, and the slightest violation could result in severe reprimands or discontent. These divisions created invisible but firm boundaries that made it impossible to form friendships or close relationships between the two worlds. For the servants and the owners, every encounter was formal, and even a brief conversation about everyday matters felt like a violation of the rules. This created constant tension and a feeling that everyone was in their own closed space. Even members of the same family were often isolated from each other. The huge number of rooms, long corridors, and high ceilings meant that relatives could go hours or even days without seeing each other. Strict adherence to the daily routine and the habit of keeping one's distance made personal meetings rare. Everyone had their own rooms and offices where they spent most of their time, and communication was strictly regulated. Even at dinner parties or in the living room, everyone was immersed in their duties, maintaining an appearance of friendliness, but not creating real closeness. It often happened that family members were physically together, but emotionally distant from each other. This disconnect intensified feelings of loneliness, even when loved ones were nearby. Loneliness was a problem that was difficult to solve. The hosts, burdened by social norms and etiquette, could not simply go down to the kitchen and talk to the servants or other family members as equals. Every action and every encounter was subject to rules and conventions that dictated who could communicate with whom and in what form. Social expectations forced people to keep their distance, maintain outward strictness, and avoid showing natural emotions. Even the desire for simple human closeness was met with invisible walls of rules that made easy communication impossible. This created the feeling that the luxurious mansion was not a home in the usual sense, but rather a complex stage for displaying status and wealth, devoid of warmth and sincerity. This lifestyle was not only uncomfortable, but also psychologically difficult. Constant control, strict rules, and a lack of genuine intimacy turned even the luxurious halls and cozy rooms into a cold space where one felt lonely. Every corner of the house, from the bright living rooms to the gloomy corridors, was a reminder of the distance that could not be overcome. Even with enormous wealth and a large number of servants, luxury did not compensate for the emptiness in human relationships. A feeling of anxiety, wariness, and social isolation was ever present, making the house more like a prison of rules and formalities than a place of rest and warmth. Despite its outward beauty and wealth, the atmosphere of the mansion remained cold, and the lives of its inhabitants were filled with loneliness and inner tension. We conclude our immersion into the world of the Victorian mansion. We have seen that behind the external splendor and luxury lay a harsh reality full of cold, dampness, smog, noise, and hard work. These houses, built to demonstrate wealth, were paradoxically uncomfortable to live in. They required constant attention and enormous effort on the part of the servants to maintain even the appearance of comfort. The history of Victorian mansions is a reminder that material wealth does not always equal quality of life. What we consider basic comforts today, clean heat, hot water, clean air, were unavailable even to the most privileged members of society. True comfort came into our homes not through wealth, but through scientific and technological progress, which gave us electricity, central heating, and modern sanitation systems. What do you think about the true cost of living in a Victorian mansion? Which of these everyday problems did you find most unbearable? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical research that will forever change your perception of the past.